Okay, I think we'll get started. It's 5 o'clock. So I want to thank you all for being here virtually this evening. Merci à tout le monde et bonsoir. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the gallery in McClure is situated in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, the unceded indigenous territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Nous sommes reconnaissants de pouvoir exercer nos activités sur ce territoire et de partager notre expérience avec la communauté. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. This evening, I have the great pleasure of introducing Erik Nieminen. Erik a obtenu une BFA à l'Université d'Ottawa et une MFA à Concordia. Il a exposé en Europe et en Amérique du Nord, and this has included recent exhibitions in Montreal, in New York, and in London. Il a reçu de nombreux prix, incluant la bourse Elizabeth Green Shields, et il est devenu le grand gagnant de la Bombay Sapphire Artisan Series in 2018. With this virtual guided visit, he will talk with you about his exhibition at the McClure Gallery, which opens today. And in this exhibition, he explores questions that are deeply connected to the issues that are omnipresent in our current society. So now we will hear from Erik himself. So thank you virtually.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the exhibition. First of all, I want to thank everyone at the McClure Gallery, including Natasha, Timmy, Catherine, and especially René Duval, who was here for the installation of the exhibition and provided many very useful insights as to how the space works. So I thought to start off, we just do a little overview of the exhibition, just get a sense of what's in it, and then I'd talk about the process for a bit, and then talk about each work sequentially. So really, when we're looking at these works, it's easy to think about the themes that are depicted, maybe urban space, nature, things of that sort. The subject matter, in other words, because they're figurative, or at least predominantly figurative paintings. But really, these paintings are about artifice and theatricality and something about the unreal, in fact. And so it's really a confrontation between a sort of abstract idea and a figurative result. And I'll explain more about that as I talk about the process. So therefore, you might think that there is an actual message to be gleaned from these works, and there can be, but the message is not necessarily one that's established at the outset of the work. And all these works, therefore, are metaphors, and painting really is a metaphor, all painting, but especially painting of a figurative nature. When you take something three-dimensional and transpose it into a two-dimensional realm, it automatically becomes a metaphor. And so really what we're thinking about then is how figuration works in relation to a painted space and different kinds of depiction, and maybe photographic depiction, video depiction, and all these works have relations to that idea. But I do really see this work as something that's separate from that in its own way and exists on its own terms, really for itself. It's a reality that's created that reminds us of our world, but is in fact different from it, and is separate from any sort of mechanical or photographic existence. And in that sense is also a kind of post-photographic painting and maybe almost a post-digital painting, as ideas about digital distortion and kind of digital imagery inform these works subconsciously, but aren't in fact a part of their literal making. So while there are distortions of reality and so on in these works, it's in a sense creating a sort of pseudo or false distortion that reminds us of digital distortions, but is in fact made entirely through a handmade process. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about the actual process and creation of these works. And in the front space of the gallery, we can see a bunch of sketches lined up from start to finish, which articulates the process much more clearly. And perhaps we could come up and look at the first drawing. And so what I always say is that content follows form. And in this case, most of my works start out with a very, very loose, almost geometric, abstract-like drawing, where it's just shapes interacting and colliding with each other. There's no exact idea about what's going to be depicted, if anything. And sometimes the paintings do end up in a more abstract realm, less necessarily objective or figurative. It all depends on the needs of the painting. And so this is the sketch for work in the show, and we can see that there's just circles and triangles and squares and other sorts of lines interacting. And so eventually, you know, I do all sorts of sketches like this, dozens and dozens, and eventually something will jump out at me and require further investigation. And so then I'll think about that and start doing looser, kind of scribbly sketches where the forms feel more organic in a sense. And here we can almost start to see forms that look almost maybe like leaves or branches or organic forms, in other words, maybe water. And at that point, I'm still not sure what's going to be in the painting. I've not actually used a photo reference or anything of that sort. But I do find that there's potential, and so I start to make a much more directional kind of solid composition. So in this case, as you can see, the lines are becoming much more reinforced and the actual space is starting to take shape. And it's at this point then, transitioning to the next drawing, that I start going through dozens of photographic references, but also video that I take. I take hours of video at various locations and go through it frame by frame until something interesting jumps out. And so I'll take maybe a leaf from here and a branch from there and a clump of foliage from somewhere else, maybe an animal here or there, and start to strategically insert them into this space in a way that makes sense in relation to the forms that were there previously. And so really then, as we move to the next drawing, which is a charcoal study, which we can see is becoming much more, in fact, defined. The figuration, if we want to call it that, is really just an alibi for the geometric shapes that we saw at the beginning of the sequence. So therefore, the meaning itself of the work, if we want to think about it in that terms, comes to fruition through the process of creating the work, purely through its formal existence. And so once we've defined that, then there's a final color study which establishes the tonal shade values, the color values, the different interlocking relationships, just to get a sense of what might happen in the work itself and really sort of make sure it's worth pursuing, in fact, because I don't find that I can necessarily jump right into a work with success all the time. I do have to put it aside, put the sketches aside for a certain amount of time before actually engaging in the work, because the work itself is a very long process. It's 2 to 3 months usually of work, and so I have to be quite sure about the potential that's found in the sketches before actually engaging in the large work. So we can then take a look at the eventual work. And so throughout the whole process, I think it's important to emphasize that chance plays a role, craftsmanship plays a role, control, lack of control. All these things are issues that come into play, not consciously, but these are all subconscious things that happen throughout the process as things move about in the work. And oil paint really allows that kind of process to happen as it layers, and each work has anywhere from about 5 to 15 different layers of paint of varying thicknesses and opacities, which creates different kinds of light within the space. So this work is actually from the previous body of work, but is also the first work that was made for this exhibition. And so it functions as a kind of introduction as well, as a bridge from what I was doing before until now. So it's really about exploring semi-invented spaces where architecture and nature collide. And in this case, the title of this work is called In the Looking Glass, which derives from the story Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, which was, of course, about Alice tumbling into another world, another existence, going through the glass and discovering a fantastical, surreal world that, of course, had all sorts of commentary about society and the world that Lewis Carroll existed in at the time. And so this work is creating another world of its own. And what I was trying to do was literally be in that in-between space, that liminal space that's in the glass where you're tumbling from one world into the next, and it's all quite uncertain. So here we have maybe a world of the past and a world of the future, and in the middle is this bird, just sort of maybe representing us all as we travel through life, really. So we can continue into the main gallery space and look at some of the other works. So I'm very interested in this idea of paradise and these kinds of paradisical spaces that we find in the middle of cities, so zoos, botanical gardens, biodomes, and the potential that they hold symbolically, but also formally as interesting visual spaces. So it's not that these spaces are necessarily about a message about climate change or things of that sort, but they do, in a sense, provide a commentary, if you wish, on the idea of control, or does nature control mankind, or is it vice versa, or which way is it really going? It's all very uncertain, but I'm not trying to make a definite statement. It's really just about creating possibilities, and that's really what my job is in its entirety, is to create possibilities. So the title of this work, Paradise Not Lost, derives from John Milton's epic poem from 1667 titled Paradise Lost, which was about the fall of man and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and that sort of rather traumatizing story. And so we find these spaces in the middle of cities, which are, in a sense, an attempt to reclaim a lost innocence, or a kind of primordial genetic purity that I think we all seek out and feel. And at a certain point, it's difficult to know exactly where the work is going, but what actually led me to use John Milton's poem as a reference point for this work was this form here, this conglomeration of leaves that at a certain point in the process was reminding me of the wings of an angel as it was sort of tumbling down into space. And whether the actual final work itself necessarily kept that spirit or energy about it, it really provided a direction and a kind of symbolic, mythical, allegorical direction in terms of the actual messaging, if you wish, and kind of vibration or atmosphere that I wanted to create. So sort of just on the edge of everything falling apart, maybe a bit of fearfulness, but also hope. So there's an attempt to keep things as neutral as possible. And so, again, perhaps we are this little monkey as we were the bird in the previous painting. Sort of unsure where to go next, but we have to go somewhere after all. We can't stay on this tree forever. And I think it's worth mentioning also that in terms of the idea of paradise, I really do consider painting itself to be a kind of paradise. In fact, painting is just another form of visual expression, another form of representation or a way of discussing the world. But it's very different from all the other kinds of images that we experience. It's very slow, it's not fast. It has a history, it's made. Every mark, in fact, has its own kind of embedded energy within it. And so it's a paradise away from every other kind of fast, gettable image that we're inundated with each day. So it really encourages you to slow down and take a close look and sort of find meaning in it within your own interpretation, which is partly why I don't make overt social statements or political statements at the outset with the works. So we'll take a look at the work on the far wall next. So this work, it exists as part of my ongoing interest and fascination with urban space, the urban habitat. I see all my paintings as different kinds of habitats, and this one happens to be colloquially known as cities, and so therefore habitats for humans. It's a space that's created to sort of organically serve the functions of humans, but really doesn't necessarily do a good job of that, and it's a fascinating subject to investigate. My earliest interests in art really were the Italian futurists and the cubists, and that actually was quite a significant inspiration for this work, which I'll get to in just a moment. I'll just say first that the futurists were a group of Italian artists that began painting, or at least the movement of futurism began in approximately 1909 and ended more or less at the advent of the Second World War, though the main impetus, or the main portion, the most famous part of the movement was from 1910 to about 1915. And so this work is titled "The City Rests." And it gets its title, in fact, from a painting made in 1910 by the Italian futurist Umberto Boccioni, who made a work called "The City Rises," in which he depicted a very large red horse twisting in space, sort of coming apart. But really, the futurists celebrated the machine age and the advance of technology and sort of the destruction of old-fashioned thinking, and celebrated speed and light and all these sorts of things in their painting. And also, it has to be said, had a rather unfortunate political side, which was, in the end, rather fascist, actually. But the artists, at least at the outset, those working from 1910 to 1915, mostly didn't really care much for the social side of it, and really were just tagging along, in essence, as a way to promote their aesthetic investigations, instead of really the promotion of all the sort of pseudo-social concepts that were promoted alongside. In any case, when this work developed and it became clear that there was a horse-like formation developing in the drawings, I started to think about this other work by Boccioni and what it would mean to have a horse in a city now, given maybe what the results have been of this advance in technology and urban sprawl and things of this sort. And in New York, I had taken a bunch of photos documenting riot horses or police horses. And I thought what was actually interesting sometimes is that they have these shields over their eyes, which function as protection, but also at a certain angle look like blinders, and in fact make the horse seem quite sort of helpless and almost lost. And so I thought it was interesting to include my own version of a red horse as sort of a sequel to Boccioni's painting, which doesn't necessarily imply a pessimistic end to that grand advance of technology that he was commenting on, but maybe indicates just sort of a little bit of a skeptical eye about all these things and what's really of value, and there's little points of interest in the painting. You know, there's this sort of serene bit of rolling hills over there that's located within the architecture, and a sort of X-ray version of palm trees over there, but none of that necessarily goes to point toward a specific message, and really it's in combination with the form and the content that we can derive an actual meaning. So we'll look at another work. This one's called Clear Enigma. So I'm not the sort of artist that really works well with repetition. I get bored quite easily if I work in series, for instance. And so this was a work that was, in essence, an exhalation after making several works that were quite detailed, at least detailed in terms of content. I should add that detail actually, we tend to colloquially think of detail as the amount of things shown in a space, especially with figurative works, so the complexity of an architectural rendering or what have you. But you can also think of detail in another way, which is really what is happening in this painting. And really this work is actually as detailed as all the others. So it's the detail that's inherent in the process of the layering of the paint, of the surface itself, the technical narrative in effect. And so if we get up close, we can really see that, or from a certain angle, you can see the roughness of the surface, that in fact the entire space is made up of just a multitude of hundreds or thousands of dots, which then combine to create a kind of a shimmer, you could say. I think that the roughness of the surface is also something that's not self-evident with some of these works, especially when they're seen in reproduction. It's not a conventional thing to do with figurative painting. But as I stated earlier, I'm not particularly interested in figurative painting per se. I'm really more interested in just creating some unique apparition on the canvas. And so the roughness of the surface at times prevents me from getting too precious about rendering things and about making sure everything's perfect. The other thing I noticed with this work, and with this exhibition, in fact, overall, is the amount of blue that's employed. It's quite a blue exhibition, and in this case, a very blue painting. It's a very evocative color and means so much to everyone. It's half of what you experience when you go outside each day. And in this case, though, the blue comes to me via New Year's Eve in Berlin, where each New Year's Eve, chaos reigns and World War III breaks out in the form of intense celebrations with fireworks, where literally the entire city is covered in exploding fireworks, mostly illegally. And at approximately 4 a.m., once they finally stop, what's left is this milky haze, just smoke wafting through the city, and accompanied, naturally, in this case, by police cars and police lights. And so, wandering the streets at that time on New Year's Eve, you get a very surreal, uncanny kind of experience where you're walking through blue haze. And so, that was my experience and what led to this painting eventually, where nature is attempting to reclaim the urban space once again. So I thought we could now look at the largest work in the show. This work's called Transmutation in the Big Blue. And very often the works really just begin with simple feelings. In this case, there were two. One, I wanted to make a big painting that was blue. And the other was I wanted to make a painting that was compositionally based on an X. So I guess in terms of subject, it might be surprising seeing an underwater scene all of a sudden. But it really falls in line with the artificial spaces that I mentioned earlier, such as biodomes and so on. And in these spaces, you do often encounter underwater spaces where you can get up close to the glass and see fish and so on. And so it's really part of the same thematic in that sense. And these spaces, they're very interesting. They're very surreal and lacking in gravity. And painting, in fact, is something that is, in essence, aside from its actual objecthood, is something that doesn't have gravity. There's no gravity in a painting other than its literal gravity in terms of paint. And so it's very much to do with space. It's a spatial experience. So we see here that the X eventually is used in a way to create confrontation. So we see there's this sort of formation here, there's this conglomeration of figures here, there's this sort of bizarre organic space here, and this kind of cloth or plastic-like form here. And so then in the center we have this rather nuclear kind of green, this radiating sort of artificial green that's almost sickly, really, as the sort of pivot point around which everything else exists. And so we have all these elements, but then because of the X-like composition, come into contact. It's an implied sort of confrontation of elements. And I find that quite interesting to create an experience that's both static and X being the most stable of forms, but also creates a sense of dynamic movement. In this case, as with all the others, a lot of unexpected things happen, which goes back to my mentioning earlier that chance plays quite a role. And in this case, this plastic that I based on all sorts of plastics that I have hanging in my studio that I use for experimentations with light, sort of distortions and things that I can glean, and then use those abstract forms that are found in these distortions to then apply to paintings and aid in the creation, essentially, of the form of the painting. In this case, this plastic is literally depicted here, but then it started to basically transform itself into a bird-like creature, if we want, which is then confronting this swirling mass of fish. So it's, again, without over-explaining anything in terms of message, which I'm hesitant to do, but we can derive, again, this confrontation of artificial forces with natural organic states. So with that, we'll move to the last painting in the exhibition. It's titled Transformer. And it's based on the previous painting, as is fairly evident. It was really done quite quickly, actually. For me, as I said, most works take 2 to 3 months at least. This work took just a little under 2 weeks and was made in almost a manic fever, if you wish. It's an extension of the aesthetic language of the previous painting, pushing it into almost unknown territory for me, and that's part of what made it so exciting. And it's in fact quite difficult to talk about just yet because it's so fresh. It was only finished about a week and a half ago. But it found its place in the show, and I thought it necessary to show. So it's really about something falling apart, disintegrating, and maybe being recreated on the canvas. It's in a constant state, a constant cycle of this process. And in fact, that mirrors the actual process of making the work. But I think the other reason to actually show it in the exhibition was that this work and its previous work in fact point towards future directions. And I do find it quite interesting, therefore, to have a work at the beginning, which we looked at, which was ending one body of work, and then this work, which is in a sense basically pointing out future possibilities that may happen outside of this exhibition, but in future works, as a kind of beginning and an end. And I should also mention that bodies of work, this conventional notion of creating a body of work for a show, it doesn't really exist for me. It's really just something that happens in the context of having a show. And so the process in the studio is entirely fluid. It's just one work kicking open the door to the next one. And so any sort of borders and boundaries, none of that exists. And really those are just imposed on the works in a gallery space. And so this work is something that maybe points out something about to be kicked down into the future. What that is, I don't know. As I said, it was just completed, but yeah. So that's an overview of the show. And my hope, of course, is that everybody can come see it in person. It's a little bit difficult right now. It's hard to know what's happening and what will be open or closed, but at the moment, this is open, this show, until October 24th. And there's usually very few people in the gallery at once, so no need to worry on that front. And I would hope that potentially these works can find some sort of meaning through maybe a past experience or a future experience or something in each person's lives that resonates in some way. So I guess if there's any questions or anything like that, I'd be happy to answer, or whatever happens next.
All right, thank you so much, Erik, for that wonderful overview and background on a lot of these works. We did have one question that came in, and I want to open this up to all of you. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments, and I'll be able to share those questions with Erik. But one question did come in about the size of the paintings. Just kind of in general, getting a sense of the size since people aren't in the space. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, because really my main interest is in creating space in a painting. The size therefore matters quite a lot, and it's how the viewer relates in a physical way to what's depicted on the wall, and also on a personal level, for me, the size relates to how it's created. Is it created with the arm, or is it created with the wrist? And so some of these works were made specifically for this space at the McClure Gallery. So this larger work on this wall was created to exist on its own on a wall, and it would hold the wall, and the viewer could move up close and move alongside it, and therefore also had physical experience with the work. And so it's really about distance and viewing distance and experiencing the work. So that's really what I have in mind with actual sizes. In a sense, you could also say that all works function very spatially. It just depends how close you want to get. You can look at a vermeer and you get up close and it's all quite an intimate experience, or you can get far away and not see anything. But in these works, I want them to read from a long distance back and up close, just in a different kind of way. So that's basically what I was thinking in terms of space and size.
Great. Thank you. And we do have a question here from L. Cost about the term post-photographic.
Right.
The question is this a new term? And can you speak about this term?
Post-photographic, really, I'm thinking of, because we think of figurative works of this sort that clearly use photos as a source, as part of the process. And we think about that as maybe a one-to-one transposition, so as if we're copying photos. But it's really more of a kind of putting aside photographic language and starting from scratch, from drawing, instead of taking a photo and then thinking, okay, what can I do with this photo to make a painting? Instead, it's taking a drawing and then applying a photo almost as an overlay to that, but in fact, not just one photo, but dozens, and maybe video and other sorts of things. So it's painting that uses photography as maybe a hint and a nod to other kinds of language, but doesn't actually use it in an overt way to sort of copy what's in the photo. That's the general sense of what I mean by post-photographic.
That's wonderful. Thank you. We have two more questions that came in. One from Alvin Richard. Yes. Does cinema, especially sci-fi, have an influence on your work? Have aspects of Jurassic Park or The Abyss?
No, not particularly. I think cinema, if it has an influence, it's maybe something like film noir, actually, where it's really about the light and light creating form and narrative. Science fiction, not particularly, except for the idea of dystopia and utopia, and that is something that I'm quite interested in, particularly with the paintings of that are based in biodomes and zoos and things like this. There are these mini sort of false utopias that exist surrounded by such a problematic and complicated setting, which is the city. But yeah, not Jurassic Park. Unless we see Jurassic Park as a kind of dystopia, I suppose, but nothing beyond that.
Okay, great. And one more here. Frank Mulvey, could your imagery be compared to tuning in to multiple channels of visual information, which then try to reconcile their differences?
Well, hi, Frank. I think it's hard to know exactly what he's getting at there, but I think in terms of, if I think about visual channels, I'm maybe thinking about different kinds of media, different kinds of mediums, so therefore things like other forms of art making, maybe video, photo, installation, sculpture, things like that, or even just within painting, as we talked about before, abstraction and representation. And because I'm not really interested in adhering to any one particular kind of, I guess we could say, style or anything like that, I do think of these works as a kind of no-style form of painting, in a sense that whatever is necessary along the way in the process is what delivers the final outcome. So therefore, I am taking from multiple channels, both subconscious and conscious, and trying to merge them into one existence, one experience, if that's what Frank is getting at.
Great. There was a question. Okay, I'm going to answer this one. It's not for you, Eric, but it applies to your show. Elle Cost had asked, well, she said thank you for your response, but also she'd love to see the work live. The gallery is open during these new measures, ? And I'll respond to that with yes, the gallery is open. Our Visual Arts Center is open, and we're a community organization, so our services are maintained. The gallery itself does sell artwork. There are works that are for sale. And our designation in Quebec with the Quebec government is one that situates us as a commercial kind of space because those artworks are for sale. So as far as, currently, we are open, and we'll just keep our eyes and ears peeled to any new information that comes in from the government. And as Eric mentioned, very few people are allowed in the space at a time. Right now, it's only 5 people maximum from the outside that can come in. That's why we really recommend that you book a spot by emailing the gallery or even calling the center. And we have strict hygiene measures that are in place that you can see on our website as well. I'm going to go on to the next question here from Juliana España Keller. Do you see these works as material entanglements that are reconfigured, that are reconfiguring the world, perhaps a virtual configuration to post-human futures?
Well, when I think about reconfiguring, actually, well, I'll get to the material side in a second, I guess. But I thought actually back to what I was talking about earlier with the Italian futurists and one of their ideas about materially, in fact, reinventing and reconfiguring the universe in their works. And I have always thought about these works as something that takes something that's known, breaks it apart, and then in some way attempts to reassemble itself into some version of reality that we'd understand while looking at the work, but that we couldn't possibly experience. So therefore, the actual location of the works, if we want to talk about it psychologically, would be somewhere in between having experienced something and knowing something. Sort of that in-between space there. So that therefore allows it to point towards a possible future, but I'm not necessarily making a statement that's concretely about the future, though there can be strong implications in that direction. And that does get back to ideas about utopia and dystopia. And I think painting is an interesting medium to deal with these subjects because it's in fact not a mechanical process. It's not in any way documenting our reality. And because it's so divorced, therefore, from our world, and it can only, in fact, remind us of our world, we're allowed to play in that sandbox of information and create maybe statements about the future on our own from the work itself, if that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you. Okay. I'll just, Frank did add something. Channels as in nature imagery woven in with architectural imagery.
Sorry, there was just a noise here. What was that? Sorry?
Frank added on channels as in nature imagery woven in with architectural imagery and other layers of images.
Right, yes. So yes, absolutely. I mean, this is probably my great area of like aesthetic interest with these works is in fact the confrontation between pseudo-modernist architecture, I guess, that we find in cities and organic forms, which are always maybe struggling for an awkward kind of coexistence and particularly tend to come to rather fascinating fruition in these sort of zoos and biodomes where there's often these big skylights and so on that work like minimalist paintings practically, like if you know James Turrell's light work, these big boxes of light. So it illuminates organic form in an interesting way, provides interesting color scenarios and so on, but also symbolically is a sort of eternal struggle, which is what was referred to in the work Paradise Not Lost that we talked about earlier. Sort of an attempt to reclaim nature through the process of traveling through these architectural spaces and then telling that story through the painting.
Great. I will, and he says, awkward coexistence, well said, exclamation point. So there's another question here from Céline Genet. In Paradise Lost, I am fascinated by the rail in the front. It is as if we can grip to it and stabilize in gravity. Was this a preoccupation of some sort?
Merci, Céline. Yes, the railing is actually what attracted me to this space in the first place. On location, it was a wood railing, but it hung out over the space as a platform to view the rest, and really opened the space up. And in my attempt to really kind of destabilize the space and make sure that, also that there's no sort of conventional mechanical perspectives happening in the work, there's actual subtle sort of moments of reverse perspective that can be found in the railing. So we have maybe this bar here that descends into space in a downward motion, but then its opposite architectural phenomena here actually ascends upwards. So there are two opposite spatial ideas, in fact impossible in real life and architecturally unstable. And then the color, this sort of shifting gradient of color that essentially mainly serves to relate to the other forms in the work, so we have the reds here that sort of drift down into the foliage that then tie off the green, mostly about complementary relationships, and these sort of yellows and oranges entering into the blues here, and same thing over here. So yes, it's meant to squeeze the space and enlarge it all at once, provide an entrance for the viewer into the work, more or less as I experienced when I was on location.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions in here, but as you'll see, if you go into the Facebook feed later, there's a lot of accolades. People are very impressed with your work. It's very beautiful. A lot of congratulations, a lot of bravos, both for the work and for your talk. The work is just obviously very skillful, thought-provoking, and beautiful. Kind of very tactile. I want to go in and touch it. And your talk has been very eloquent and insightful and rich. And I want to thank you for that. If there aren't any other questions, I think, unless you want to add anything else, Erik?
No, really. I really just want to thank anyone that tuned in to watch, anyone that liked what I had to say or liked what they saw. It's very gratifying to know that someone was out there listening, and I hope as many people as possible can come see the show in person, as that's where the works really exist, is in real space, but be it as it may in this time of strange uncertainty, I hope that the show provides something for everyone, and just thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Erik, and we're very proud and thrilled to have your work in the McClure Gallery. Merci et tout le monde. Merci à tout le monde qui était ici ce soir pour cet événement. I want to wish you all a very great evening, and I hope to see you soon. Merci, bonsoir, et à bientôt.